When Holly finally wakes up, she is horrified to discover herself trapped inside a metal cage. She desperately tries breaking the lock with her bare hands, but everything is useless. The story begins with a man named Seth living a painfully repetitive and lonely life. Every single day feels exactly the same, as if nothing exciting has ever happened to him, and nothing ever will. Every morning, Seth wakes up, cleans himself up, eats a simple breakfast, takes the bus, and heads to work. He works as a caretaker at an animal shelter, where his responsibilities are quiet and routine, cleaning cages, feeding dogs, and taking care of abandoned animals. Once his shift ends, Seth usually goes straight home without stopping anywhere else, as though his entire existence is trapped inside the same endless cycle. But one ordinary bus ride changes everything. One evening, Seth notices a woman sitting nearby who seems strangely familiar. After staring at her more carefully, he suddenly realizes she is Holly, a girl he used to know back in school. Feeling nervous yet fascinated, Seth finally gathers the courage to speak to her. He softly calls out Holly's name, even though Holly clearly has no idea who he is. She even tries to remember him, but Seth casually explains that it makes sense because they were never really close back then. Even so, Seth admits that he still remembers her very clearly. Their conversation only lasts a few moments before Holly reaches her stop. Before she leaves, Seth awkwardly asks if they could maybe meet again sometime. However, Holly says nothing and simply walks away. Even though the encounter is brief, Seth cannot stop thinking about her. To him, Holly feels like the perfect woman he has always dreamed about. Slowly, his curiosity begins turning into obsession. That same night, Seth searches for Holly online. He finds her social media accounts and becomes consumed with learning everything about her hobbies, favorite bands, interests, and details about her personal life. The next day at work, Seth asks his coworker Nate for advice on how to get closer to a woman. At first, Nate does not seem interested in helping because he is not particularly close with Seth. But after realizing Seth is serious, Nate eventually gives him a few suggestions. He explains that the best way to approach a woman is by learning the things she likes and slowly giving her attention over time. Later that day, Seth is asked to help a doctor put down an old dog at the shelter, a dog that turns out to be his favorite. The doctor even suggests that Seth adopt the animal instead so it would not need to be euthanized. However, Seth refuses because pets are not allowed where he lives. After the procedure, Seth helps burn the dog's body before returning to clean the cages again. While working, he accidentally discovers an abandoned room hidden deep inside the shelter. Seth quietly stares at the room for a moment before walking away. That night, Holly once again fills his mind. Seth writes down all the things she likes while practicing conversations in front of the mirror, so he will not feel nervous when speaking to her again. The following day, Seth finally visits the restaurant where Holly works. Coincidentally, Holly is the one serving him. Once again, Seth tries to make Holly remember him, but Holly does not seem interested and simply focuses on her job. Even so, Seth keeps trying. After Holly serves him, Seth immediately invites her to a concert for her favorite band. He pretends that his friend canceled at the last minute, leaving him with one extra ticket. Unfortunately, the invitation only makes things awkward. Holly politely rejects him because she already has a boyfriend. Instead of making Seth back away, the rejection only causes his obsession to grow stronger. He secretly begins following Holly everywhere she goes and eventually learns where she lives. Over time, Holly starts feeling like someone may be watching her, so she tells her best friend Claire about it. However, Claire responds casually and jokes that the guy can approach Holly as long as he is handsome. After calming down slightly, Holly calls her boyfriend Eric. During the conversation, it becomes obvious that their relationship is not going very well. Later, Holly talks to Claire about Eric again. Claire even advises Holly to leave him because Eric has cheated on her before and repeatedly hurt her emotionally. The next day, while Holly is working at the restaurant, she is suddenly informed that someone has sent flowers for her. Curious, Holly checks the bouquet and finds a card that says, "Be mine." At first, Holly assumes the flowers came from Eric. Because of that, after work, she immediately visits Eric at the bar where he works and asks him to stop sending flowers like that. However, Eric looks genuinely confused and tells her that he never sent her any flowers. Unbeknownst to Holly, Seth is secretly nearby, listening to their conversation. Feeling embarrassed after realizing she misunderstood the situation, Holly heads to the restroom to calm herself down. But without her noticing, Seth quietly follows her there. Seth brings up the flowers again and indirectly admits that he was the one who sent them. At that moment, Holly finally becomes genuinely disturbed and frightened. She firmly tells Seth to stop following her because his behavior is becoming extremely creepy. Holly quickly tries to leave, but Seth continues following her until Eric finally steps in. Eric immediately punches Seth and throws him out of the bar. However, shortly afterward, Seth accidentally finds Holly's personal journal lying outside the building. After cleaning the wounds on his face, Seth begins reading Holly's journal. At first, he is only curious about her life, but the more pages he reads, the more consumed he becomes. At the same time, Seth starts thinking again about the abandoned room he previously discovered at work. The next day, while working at the shelter, he returns to the hidden room and explores it more carefully. The place turns out to be large, isolated, and rarely visited by anyone. Seeing the condition of the room, Seth comes up with a horrifying idea. He begins transforming the area into a giant metal cage strong enough to imprison a human being. Once everything is prepared, Seth continues gathering information about Holly, studying her routine, and even purchasing sedatives because he has already decided to kidnap her. Meanwhile, Holly becomes increasingly uneasy after what happened at the bar. She constantly feels like someone is watching her from a distance. One night, when a homeless man suddenly approaches her, Holly panics and immediately sprays pepper spray into his face before running away. After finally arriving home safely, Holly locks every door, closes all the curtains, and repeatedly checks outside to make sure nobody is there. Once she finally calms down, she cleans herself up and goes to bed. However, shortly after Holly turns off the lights and begins falling asleep, Seth suddenly appears from behind, covers her mouth, and injects her with sedatives until she loses consciousness. After overpowering her, Seth hides Holly's unconscious body inside a large cardboard box so it looks like an ordinary package. Later that night, he secretly brings her to the animal shelter. There, Seth unexpectedly runs into Nate, who happens to be on night duty. Nate casually asks what Seth is carrying so late at night. Remaining calm, Seth lies and says their boss asked him to deliver a package. Since Nate is not too suspicious, he simply tells Seth to sign the attendance sheet first. But suddenly, the situation becomes tense when Nate hears strange noises nearby. He immediately asks Seth to stay quiet so he can figure out where the sound is coming from. Seth starts panicking because he fears Holly may wake up inside the box. Fortunately, after checking around for a while, Nate assumes the noise is only coming from a faulty air conditioner. Seth successfully avoids suspicion and immediately carries Holly down to the secret room before locking her inside the cage. When Holly finally wakes up, she is horrified to discover herself trapped inside a metal cage. She desperately tries breaking the lock with her bare hands, but everything is useless because Seth secured the cage tightly. During her desperate attempt to escape, Holly even tears off one of her fingernails. The next day, after finishing work, Seth returns to feed Holly before leaving her alone again. From that point on, Seth only visits once a day to bring Holly food and water before abandoning her inside the cage once more. At first, Holly refuses to eat and constantly fights back, but by the second day, she begins begging Seth not to leave her alone anymore. However, Seth insists that everything he is doing is for the sake of their relationship. Not wanting to starve to death, Holly eventually starts eating and drinking whatever Seth gives her. Meanwhile, Seth feels unbelievably happy. To him, finally having Holly completely to himself makes his life feel perfect. The following day, Seth visits Holly again and begins cleaning the mess inside the cage, including removing a dead rat Holly had killed earlier. While talking, Holly asks Seth what his true intentions are. She asks whether he plans to hurt her, but Seth insists he never intended any of that. Instead, Seth claims he only wants to save her. After leaving the room, Seth nearly gets caught when he unexpectedly runs into Nate patrolling near the lower level of the building. Feeling nervous, Seth quickly leaves before Nate grows suspicious. However, The next day, when Seth returns to Holly again, the truth finally begins coming to light. Seth reveals that he has secretly been reading Holly's journal this entire time. From those pages, he discovers horrifying secrets about Holly that nobody else ever knew. It turns out that Claire, Holly's best friend who appeared several times earlier in the story, has actually been dead for a very long time. The Claire Holly keeps talking to is nothing more than a hallucination inside her mind. Inside the journal, Holly explains how everything began after she discovered that Eric had been cheating on her with Claire. That night, Holly and Claire argued inside a car, while Claire desperately tried apologizing and explaining herself. But consumed by rage, Holly suddenly slammed on the gas pedal, causing the car to crash. Even though both of them could have survived the accident, Holly completely lost control of herself. She grabbed a sharp piece of broken glass lodged in her body and stabbed Claire in the eye, killing her. After that incident, Holly's dark side fully emerged. She began getting involved with multiple men, only to manipulate and eventually murder them one by one. Instead of being horrified by the truth, Seth becomes even more obsessed after learning everything. To him, Holly is no longer just the perfect woman. She is someone who truly understands darkness the same way he does. That is why Seth convinces himself that he must protect Holly from the outside world, even if his methods are completely twisted. Having no reason to deny anything anymore, Holly simply smiles and admits to all of her crimes. Seth could have easily turned Holly over to the police after discovering the truth, but instead, he chooses to protect her secrets and continue keeping her locked inside the cage. Afterward, Seth leaves Holly alone once again. At that moment, Claire's figure appears inside Holly's imagination once more, as if she is still the only friend accompanying her in loneliness. The next day, Seth visits Holly again and gives her a piece of cloth so she can clean herself inside the cage. After making sure Holly is fine, Seth heads back upstairs because he still has to continue his normal duties at the shelter. However, Seth has started behaving differently lately. He constantly zones out and no longer focuses on his work the way he used to. While Seth is lost in thought, his female boss suddenly approaches him and asks him to come into her office. There, she criticizes him because several cages at the shelter have become filthy and poorly maintained. Previously, Seth was known as one of the most hardworking and careful employees there. His boss tells him that he no longer seems like the same person she once knew. Hearing that, Seth nervously asks whether he is going to be fired. However, his boss says she is still willing to give him one final chance. But if he makes another mistake, she will not hesitate to fire him. That night, Seth goes straight home instead of visiting Holly like he normally does. While sitting alone at home, Seth begins thinking deeply about his relationship with Holly. Slowly, he develops a desire to completely control her life. Up until now, Seth has always felt like Holly somehow controlled his thoughts and emotions, so this time he wants to prove that he is the one truly in control. The following day, Seth returns to see Holly while bringing only 2 chocolate bars as her daily meal. Feeling that the amount of food is far too little, Holly immediately asks for more. However, Seth firmly refuses and tells her that from now on, he will be the one making all the rules. He wants Holly to understand that he now has complete control over her life. Hearing that, Holly begins acting sad in front of Seth. But without Seth realizing it, Holly is actually manipulating his emotions. And just as she expected, Seth slowly starts giving in because he still loves her deeply. Eventually, Seth decides to grab extra snacks from a nearby shelf so Holly will not remain hungry. While Seth is distracted getting more food, Nate, who happens to be patrolling around the basement, accidentally discovers the hidden room. Curious, Nate enters and explores the area until he eventually finds a giant cage with a woman trapped inside. Nate is immediately horrified after realizing Holly is being held prisoner there. The moment Holly sees another person, she desperately begs Nate to free her. She tells him to find something that can break the cage lock. Still confused, Nate tries staying calm while asking what is actually happening, but Holly insists there is no time to explain. At the same time, Seth suddenly senses that something is wrong outside the room. He immediately rushes back toward the cage. The moment Seth arrives, Holly instantly notices him standing there. But instead of warning Nate, Holly secretly signals Seth to attack him. Without hesitation, Seth immediately strikes Nate with the baton he is carrying. However, Nate turns out to be far stronger than Seth expected. As Seth begins losing the fight, he quickly pulls out a folding knife and stabs Nate. With Holly helping by sticking her leg out and causing Nate to trip onto the floor, she immediately tells Seth to grab a brick before Nate can stand back up. At first, Seth hesitates, clearly horrified by what he is about to do. "You have to do exactly what I say," Holly whispers. Seth stares at Nate in terror. "Oh my God." But eventually, Seth grabs the brick and repeatedly smashes it against Nate's head until Nate finally dies. After everything is over, Seth looks completely horrified and cannot believe he has just killed someone. Meanwhile, Holly remains strangely calm throughout the entire situation. She immediately starts telling Seth how to dispose of Nate's body so nobody will ever discover what happened. Seth points out that Nate's body is too large to fit inside the furnace they use for burning dead dogs at the shelter. However, Holly calmly explains that there are other ways to erase the evidence. She instructs Seth to cut Nate's body into smaller pieces, remove anything that could identify him, and carefully dispose of the remains so no trace is left behind. Some pieces of Nate's flesh are even fed to the dogs, so it will appear as though nothing ever happened. Seth is completely traumatized and clearly does not want to do any of it, but Holly continues pressuring him until he finally obeys her. After everything is finished, Seth begins cleaning the blood from his clothes and body. Strangely enough, seeing Seth willing to go that far for her actually causes Holly to develop feelings for him. In the middle of the tense situation, Holly even asks Seth to come closer because she feels cold and wants him to warm her up. However, Seth gently refuses and explains that he never intended to force himself on her in that kind of way. While cleaning the remaining bloodstains, Seth becomes overwhelmed with fear and regret. He cannot stop thinking about what would happen if the police ever discovered the murder. Seth is visibly trembling because deep inside, he realizes that his life has already been destroyed. However, unlike Seth, Holly remains incredibly calm. In a relaxed tone, Holly tells him that fear like this is perfectly normal for someone who is killed for the first time. According to Holly, all the panic and guilt will slowly fade away until Seth eventually becomes used to it. Feeling mentally exhausted and terrified, Seth finally decides to go home and leaves Holly alone inside the cage. But when Seth returns to the upper level of the shelter, he notices his female boss talking to a detective who has arrived looking for Nate after he suddenly disappeared. The moment the detective sees Seth, he immediately asks to speak with him privately. Seth is taken into a room and questioned about his relationship with Nate. Trying to remain calm, Seth explains that the two of them got along perfectly fine and never had any problems. After that, the detective asks when Seth last saw Nate. Nervously, Seth answers that the last time he saw Nate was around 9 o'clock the previous night while Nate was on duty. Seth also adds that Nate supposedly had some matters to deal with and briefly asks Seth to cover his position outside the guard area. Unfortunately, Seth's explanation only makes the detective more suspicious. Several parts of Seth's story sound inconsistent, causing the interrogation to become increasingly tense. Even so, the detective still does not have enough evidence to officially consider Seth a suspect, so Seth is eventually allowed to leave. The following day, Seth visits Holly inside the cage once again, but this time, Holly refuses to speak to him at all. She even tells Seth that he should stop visiting her if he does not truly love her. Hearing that, Seth immediately tries convincing Holly that he genuinely loves her and would do absolutely anything for her. However, Holly claims that his words mean nothing unless he is willing to prove them. Once again, Holly begins manipulating Seth's mind. She tells him to prove his love in the most extreme way possible by cutting off one of his own fingers for her. Naturally, Seth immediately refuses because he thinks the request is insane. But Holly continues manipulating his emotions until Seth eventually falls completely into her trap. In the end, Seth actually cuts off one of his own fingers just to prove his love for Holly. However, after Seth commits such a horrifying act, Holly immediately takes advantage of his weakness. While Seth is distracted by the pain, Holly quickly grabs Seth's knife and threatens to hurt herself if he refuses to open the cage door. Panicking, Seth desperately tries calming Holly down because he is terrified she might actually harm herself. But Holly continues pressuring him until Seth finally gives in and unlocks the cage. The moment the cage door opens, Holly slowly steps out and walks toward Seth. For one brief moment, everything seems peaceful. Holly suddenly hugs and kisses Seth as if she truly accepts him. But the entire thing is nothing more than a trick. The second Seth lowers his guard, Holly suddenly slashes his neck with the knife, seriously injuring him. The story then shifts to Holly, who has finally escaped captivity and returned to living a seemingly normal life. She even reunites with Eric. One morning, while preparing breakfast, Holly accidentally sees something on Eric's phone and realizes that he is still cheating on her with another woman. After discovering the betrayal, Holly quietly grabs a kitchen knife and slowly walks toward Eric. For a moment, the scene becomes incredibly tense, making it seem as though Holly is about to kill him. But unexpectedly, Holly simply hands Eric his phone without saying a single word before leaving the house. Not long afterward, Holly heads toward a place that now feels disturbingly familiar. She returns to the underground room where Seth once kept her imprisoned. However, the situation has now completely changed. Before, Holly was the one trapped inside the cage. But now, Seth is the one locked inside instead. Seth's condition looks absolutely miserable. His body has become thin and weak, his skin is dry and wrinkled, and his eyesight is nearly gone. Yet, strangely enough, Holly begins treating Seth with genuine care and attention. After everything they have gone through together, Holly finally realizes that Seth is the only person who truly understands the monster inside her. And this time, Seth is the one trapped inside the cage.